Hey, E, nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Glad we can both sit down and talk about Plato together.
Yeah, me too. I've been looking forward to it.
For everyone watching, my brother has had a long-standing passion about Greek philosophy and philosophy in general. He did his undergrad and then went to graduate school studying philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness, where you studied really religion and philosophy in the modern context. So I thought this would be a great format on our podcast to pick your brains, Jesse, about Plato, Socrates, and specifically the myth of where Plato writes about it at the end of his book, The Republic, in which is basically, as far as we can tell, the first recorded Western near-death experience that's ever been written. I wanted to start by asking you, can you tell us a little bit maybe about your passion of philosophy and Plato, how you found them, and then we'll get into the myth of
Sounds great. Great to be talking about Plato again. It's been a while, but yeah, I guess you and I both got interested in spirituality, comparative religion in high school, towards the end of high school. And by the time I got to undergrad, I became fascinated. I had a great professor who was a professor of religion, comparative religion. So I started taking classes with him and I got hooked. So I started studying comparative religion, comparative mythology, and certain types of esotericism and mysticism. And then when I left college, I eventually went back into a master's program in graduate school that studied philosophy, comparative religion, depth psychology, and just continued to study some of these thinkers and authors. So I've continued since then. I also have a master's, like you, in marriage and family therapy, especially through the lens of depth psychology. And something people don't fully realize about Carl Jung and the origins of depth psychology is that he had a great grasp on comparative mythology and on comparative religion as well.
Yeah, why don't you talk a little bit about who Plato was and how did he end up writing about a near-death experience?
Sure. So to pick back up on that, a professor of mine at my graduate school is named Richard Tarnas, and he wrote a great book called The Passion of the Western Mind, where he looks at the overarching narrative from ancient Greece all the way through postmodernity, especially through the lens of religion and philosophy and how it shaped Western civilization. So at the start of the book is the ancient Greeks, where he talks about Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and different schools of thought amongst the ancient Greeks. What I found so fascinating was that ancient Greeks were extremely sophisticated thinkers. Their metaphysics, their philosophical systems were extremely mature and sophisticated, so much so that actually the early Christians and the early Christian church adopted and integrated a lot of the Greek metaphysics, which became the backbone and the core of the dogma and orthodoxy of the Christian religion and Christian teachings. Alfred North Whitehead has a great quote where he says, all of Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato. So this idea that Plato and who wrote about his teacher Socrates really is not some old, ancient, dusty thinker, but really is still alive, and his philosophy is still an underpinning and has continued to inform modern philosophy. And even if people create new philosophies in reaction to those ancient philosophies. So to answer your question, Plato was a Greek philosopher around, I think, 350 to 400 BC. So around 2,400 years ago. He wrote a lot about his teacher, Socrates. There's been some debate or questioning around, was Socrates a real person? But a lot of the studies do show he was a real person. And we know him mostly through the dialogues that is what are Plato's written works often are in the form of Socratic dialogues with Socrates as the primary speaker in those books. So that's how we mostly know about Socrates, and Plato based his philosophy and system of philosophy around the teachings of Socrates. So one of his most famous books is called The Republic. I read it as an undergrad, a sophomore in college in my introduction to Western philosophy class. It's a long book. At the very end of it, Socrates is speaking to somebody and he jumps into this story. It's called a legend in the book. It's called the myth of And it's a story about a soldier who died on the battlefield and has an experience on the other side, so to speak. It's a near-death experience in the sense that he then comes back to share the story.
And the Republic and the Myth of this was a famous piece, right? A lot of people read it and it's well known.
Yeah, the Republic is the magnum opus in many ways of Plato, one of his most famous books.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that it is the final chapter of the Republic.
Yes.
Yeah.
So exactly. So one has to wonder, it's like it's saved for the very end where the whole entire book, which is like 400 or 500 pages, it's a huge book.
And it in a moment you can explain the myth, but it probably encapsulates what he talks about, which is the soul and the human body, right? That we are a soul and it can actually leave the human body through what he would call philosophy or contemplation. So anyhow, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah. And we can take a moment to talk about it now before the actual myth.
Yeah,
but
sure.
Yeah, the essence is that, well, first of all, it's interesting to note that the ancient Greeks, the majority of them did believe in reincarnation. So implicit, like the Buddhists, like the Hindus, a lot of ancient cultures believed in reincarnation. A lot of indigenous cultures did. And in that teaching is the idea that the body is just a temporary shell, or it's a temporary vehicle that the soul inhabits in order to learn and grow. And when the body is done, when the old age comes, the soul lives on after death, goes into an afterlife, kind of an astral realm. Different cultures talk about it. Plato has an idea that comes through in this myth of about what the afterlife looks like for souls after they leave their body. But the essence of it, and Plato's entire philosophy, is really centered around this idea that the human life is brief and we should be focusing on the soul, cultivating the virtues and the qualities of the soul, which are eternal and which will serve us after we die and go into this next world, as opposed to focusing and being driven by the appetites and the desires of the body, of the flesh, which is often around making money, greed, good food, wine, sex, comforts of the body. So there was a little bit of that polarity, or it can look a little otherworldly or transcendent focused, deny the body and the senses. But the idea being that we need to remember the soul and the importance of cultivating virtue while we're living here.
And to me, that's one of the greatest takeaways from NDEs, is they say very similar things, which is, there's a lot of our actions and thoughts and works can be judged by ourselves often, but more wholesome, virtuous, loving, caring actions versus maybe harmful, unskillful, mean actions. And there's some astral metaphysics around cause and effect, karma or whatnot. So it's pretty amazing. He and Socrates were talking about and teaching this 2,000 or 3,000 years ago.
Yeah.
So why don't you take us into the myth of
Great. Sure. Try to keep it brief. It's quite a long and detailed account, but the gist of it is was a man from an ancient Greek town. He was in a battle. He died, was killed on the battlefield. And after 10 or 11 days, folks collected the bodies and they were about to burn them on the funeral pyre. And that is when apparently woke up, and everyone was shocked. And he then told his story of where he had been for those past 12 days total that he had been dead. So he tells the story of going to this great field, traveling for what seemed like a very long time, coming to this beautiful open field. And eventually he comes to this place where there are two tunnels coming down from up above. He couldn't see where. And then two tunnel openings coming up from the ground from down below. And he saw souls coming down out of these tunnels and coming up out of the tunnels from the ground. There was a being there that told him, just observe and watch so that you can go back to Earth and tell people what you see. So he was instructed early on that he was not going to stay there. He was being shown what occurs on the other side to share it back with humans back on Earth. So what he noticed was that the souls that were coming down from these tunnels from up above looked fresh, clean, like radiant, joyful. He described it almost as like people who come out of a bath in a nice robe, clean and refreshed. And they told stories of being in these heavenly spheres of beauty and bliss and incredible delights and just a beautiful experience. He noticed that the souls coming up from below were the opposite. They were ragged, gaunt, horrified, crying, lamenting, terrified, basically telling stories of what we would call a hell realm, of punishment, of fearful. They were really terrified. And he describes them as lamenting and crying and really upset. So they were coming up as well. So automatically you have this idea of less of like an eternal hell, eternal heaven, but more like the Buddhists, like where there's phases that you would spend time, kind of like purgatory, where you move through and come back out. And then he was shown these three goddesses, the god of necessity, where it's almost like lottery tickets. All these souls would line up and they were given a lottery ticket, which included them choosing what their next human life was going to be. And again, was told, just observe. You can't participate or do anything, just watch so you can go back to Earth to share. And what he saw was that these different souls would choose their next life on Earth, but that included souls making mistakes. So one example he shares is that some of the souls coming down from the heavenly spheres were kind of in such a relaxed, easygoing, like mood that they would choose. He saw one man choose a life of a dictator or a tyrant for his next life on Earth. And if anyone knows Plato, that's one of the worst things you can be, in the sense that it's really easy to cause harm as a dictator or tyrant. Politicians have such wide influence that if you are not truly ethical and moral and virtuous, you can inadvertently cause tremendous bad karma by causing suffering. It's easy to get caught up in the lust for power, like Lord of the Rings, So only after he was then given this life as a dictator or tyrant did the soul realize he had made a mistake. And says he saw this soul lamenting and like really upset that he had forgotten and chosen this life. And then he saw other people who had lived really middle of the road lives, boring, kind of, they chose similar lives, not out of some wisdom, but just because it's the same type of life. Or he saw people who'd had really difficult, traumatizing lives, those coming up from the ground below. They chose lives of animals because it seemed like a really peaceful, easy, simple life without too much suffering. So he described different souls and their journey of choosing their life. And then they would go to this river of forgetfulness, drink from the water, which is when they would forget all about this experience on the other side, and they would be birthed into their mother's womb to start their new human life. That's the pretty much brief of it. But throughout it, and the moral of the story is that what Plato is teaching through the story that Socrates tells is that we have to be really careful about our actions, and we have to be really careful and intentional about how we choose and think of it, because to inadvertently reincarnate in lives that can cause harm, that prioritize the body for power, money, wealth, fame, pleasure, is we can inadvertently continue on this cycle of reincarnation and ultimately experience tremendous suffering. And that he says we have to remember the importance of the soul and cultivating the virtues of the soul, so that when we leave this life, we can go on to the beautiful heavenly spheres and continue on from there.
Yeah, it's so fascinating because so many religions and spiritual indigenous frameworks and saints and mystics, etc., talk about a lot of this. Like, I'm thinking the Buddha, or in Buddhism, they say, like, in terms of reincarnation, being born as a human is as rare as like a turtle surfacing on the ocean through a ring. Basically, that it's a kind of a great honor, or takes a lot of time and to be incarnated as a human. So there's kind of like a lot of responsibility or a lot of potential. And a lot of us actually kind of just coast through life, or there's like that indifference middle realm, maybe, that Plato described, which is fine. But then there's the other two extremes, right? There's very virtuous, beautiful lives of service, and maybe that soul will go into such epic, beautiful valleys and vistas after life. And then there's the opposite, whether it's a dictator, a normal person being petty and mean and harmful, then you're going to perpetuate that suffering karmically down the road. So it sounds like, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, all were very famous, and they taught this in their own way, right? In the Greek philosophical realm, which became the foundation of Roman life and a lot of the Western civilization.
Exactly. It's remarkable. And I think that's what's so interesting about finding a near-death experience in ancient Greece, Plato's account of this. And for anyone who's interested, it's a much longer story that you can find at the end of the Republic. You can even Google it. But it's really aligned with this, what's more of a modern phenomenon around studies of near-death experiences. And you have things like going into another realm, meeting beings of light, seeing how souls experienced life on the other side. He felt peace, joy, bliss. He describes a lot of the core elements. It accounts basically like a life review, the way these souls were having to account for their actions while they were alive. And it matches up, as you're saying, with a lot of religions. And it's just fascinating to see that. It's cross-cultural, it's across time and history, which is what we would expect to see if near-death experiences are a real valid phenomenon.
Yeah, exactly. This is all evidence we're putting together. A lot of people are putting together that we often call the science of the soul or science of religion. I read that Plato would often talk about contemplation or the act of philosophy as a holy or sacred act that stills the mind and body and centers a person in their soul, he would say, kind of like meditation, which is really interesting. And you were telling me a little bit about like a story of, was it Socrates, who was standing in the snow for days at a time? Maybe you could tell that to the audience.
Sure. I mean, there's two brief snippets of the life of Socrates, these accounts. One is that in war, he would go to war, he'd serve as a soldier. All the soldiers talked about Socrates having no fear of death. He would charge the enemy full speed, and it would terrify the enemy because it was apparent he had no fear of death. Just in his very essence, he was on like another level. And the other is that he would be seen for days at a time standing barefoot in the snow, gazing off into space, gazing up into the sky, and just without moving. And to you and I, that seems very similar to what the Eastern pundits or teachers talk about as samadhi, where you basically, like in some cases, the yogis would have no heartbeat, no breath, but they would just stand or sit still as a rock for hours or days in a very deep state of ecstasy or concentration, oneness with the soul, with God. And so I do believe that Socrates was a mystic, was a guru in the ancient East, in the ancient West, rather, similar to some of these yogis from the East. And I think it's important because a lot of people think of Plato or Socrates as this very heady, intellectual kind of thinkers, but they saw philosophy as a spiritual practice of living, which is also something about dying. I don't know if you want to read that quote. I have a quote I could read too, just so people can get a little glimpse of Plato's thoughts.
So I do have a quote. It's from Phaedrus, and Plato writes, "Then it is a fact, Simmias," who he's talking to, "that true philosophers make dying their profession, and that to them of all men death is least alarming. If this is so, will a true lover of wisdom who has firmly grasped the same conviction that he will never attain to wisdom worthy of the name elsewhere than in the next world, will he be grieved at dying? Will he not be glad to make that journey? So if you see anyone distressed at the prospect of dying, it will be proof enough that he is a lover not of wisdom, but of the body." And so that's him talking towards that that element, which is we are not this body, we are a soul, a consciousness that continues after death, after we drop the body. And here, and he lays out how contemplation, like meditation or a form of prayer, is a way to center more into the soul, as opposed to the body and sensations and desires. Very articulate writer and teacher.
Very articulate. And again, the Buddhists, some of the Hindu teachers, Muslims, a lot of people from a lot of traditions talk about the importance of practicing dying before you die, practicing death, preparing for death, studying mortality as a way to centralize and focus on the soul. It's so easy to be pulled by the body and its desires. It like captures our psyche. So I'll just read a quick quote as well. about this difference between how the desires of the body can easily influence us, and how it takes effort and work to continue to return, to refocus and prioritize the soul. So this is from his dialogue called Phaedo. Plato says, or rather, I guess this is being spoken by Socrates. Because every pleasure or pain has a sort of rivet with which it fastens the soul to the body and pins it down and makes it corporeal, accepting as true whatever the body certifies. The result of agreeing with the body and finding pleasure in the same things is, I imagine, that it cannot help coming to share its character and its diet, so that it can never get clean away to the unseen world, but is always saturated with the body when it sets out. And so soon it falls back again into another body where it takes root and grows. Consequently, it has no share of fellowship with the pure and uniform and divine. So here is this idea that the true purpose of a human life is to actually, what Plato referred to as, contemplate the forms, which is to contemplate the true, the good, the beautiful. The soul is a pure form, and to return our attention to the soul, to prioritize it. And when he uses the word rationality or intellect, he's really talking about the rationality or the intellect of the soul, to go so finely and focus towards the soul that you're basically merging with the divine oneness of the world. And then when you leave this body, you can go way beyond in the next life into the oneness, into these ideal pure forms, and not have to reincarnate over and over it into another body.
Yeah, it is. It's pretty incredible. And, I love, what stood out of that quote also is this idea of cleanliness, of cleansing the soul. And, as well as in the myth of seeing those souls coming down from that tunnel above, seeing them being refreshed and alive and vitalized, versus those coming up from underneath, feeling, being distraught and gaunt. And it's kind of fascinating, all of it.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I have one more quote, and then I think we could probably start to wrap up. Yeah, so this is one more quote from the same dialogue, Phaedo. Socrates says, "So long as we keep to the body and our soul is contaminated with its imperfection," that goes to what you were just saying, Elliot, about cleanliness. "So long as we keep to the body and our soul is contaminated with this imperfection, there is no chance of our ever attaining satisfactorily to our object, which we assert to be the truth. In the first place, the body provides us with innumerable distractions in the pursuit of its necessary sustenance, and any diseases which attack us hinder our quest for reality. Besides, the body fills us with loves and desires and fears and all sorts of fancies and a great deal of nonsense, with the result that we literally never get an opportunity to think at all about anything. Wars and revolutions and battles, you see, are due simply and solely to the body and its desires. All wars are undertaken for the acquisition of wealth, and the reason why we have to acquire wealth is the body, because we are slaves in its service. That is why on all these accounts, we have so little time for philosophy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it reminds me a lot of what the Buddha taught, with desire and cravings and what many religions teach. And, I think we don't have to just condemn or judge all desires as bad or keeping us locked into our body or this world. There's many amazing things in these bodies, in this world, of course. There's a lot of wholesome desires in terms of generosity and love, and as opposed to the more greed and selfish desires that cause harm to ourselves and others. I just want to thank you so much for sharing all of this, Jess, with everyone, and hopefully people got as much out of it as I did.
Yeah, thanks so much. This was a real pleasure. It was a great treat to dive back into some Plato and some ancient Greek philosophy. It's always fascinating, and I hope we can continue to find stories from different cultures to share and talk about together.
We definitely will. And I know you wrote for our latest newsletter about Plato, so anyone can read about it if you'd like at our Coming Home newsletter on Substack. And I look forward to talking to you next time.
Yeah, sounds good. Take it easy. See you soon.
See ya.